Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. On May the 9th, 1950, at 6 p.m., the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, in which today 500 million Europeans live together in peace. This was the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched a European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. Schuman's vision for Europe was for a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. And the first step was to achieve forgiveness and reconciliation between France and Germany, habitual enemies. And today's guest, this month's guest for our Schuman Talk, is Dr. Michael Schluter, who is seeking to apply the Schuman plan to the situation between North and South Korea that has been in a stalemate, really, since the end of the Korean War, following the end of the Second World War. So I want to introduce you to Michael Schluter. Hello, Mike.
Yeah.
I'll call you, I won't be so formal as to call you Dr. Schluter. We've known each other now for 15 to 20 years.
Longer.
I think I met you in 1999, I think it was. You spoke at a New Europe Forum in Brussels. And I also remember a few years later talking with you in a cafe in Cambridge. And you were telling me about meeting a young upcoming Black politician in America, whom you assured me was going to be one day the president of the United States. I'm talking about Barack Obama. Do you remember that conversation?
I do remember that, yeah.
So, Michael, you have written a number of books to do with something called relational thinking. You've written The R Factor. You have written The R Option. You've talked about The Relational Manager. A recent title that you've co-authored is Corporate Capitalism the Best We've Got to Offer? And here you are talking to a very well-known lady who sadly departed us recently, Queen Elizabeth, as she conferred upon you Commander of the British Empire for your work as a social entrepreneur, trying to bring an understanding of a society that is relational. Before we start talking about today's topic about Korea, can you tell us a bit about what is relational thinking? Where does that come from, and how did it develop in your life and work?
Yes, I assume we haven't got 2 hours for this conversation,
No,
Jeff.
we can spend a week on that, I realize.
Here's the abbreviated version. So I started right back in 1976, so I'm not as young as I once was, interested in, is there a biblically informed alternative to socialism or communism on the one side and capitalism on the other? And if so, where do I look for that in the scriptures? And my pastor led me to look at biblical law in the Old Testament as the right place to look, because that's really the most relevant for an ordinary kind of society where not everyone is a believer.
Perhaps it's helpful to say that you were in East Africa and you saw that in the north, in Ethiopia, there was the communist approach. In the south, in Tanzania, there was the socialist approach. And in Kenya itself, it was unbridled capitalism. And
That's
you said there's got to be something better than this, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So that's what actually drove me into this space. So by 1981, I had realized that actually there is a framework within biblical law that would look really interesting, but I wasn't sure what's the big idea there. Is it justice or family or sustainability of the planet? Those are all themes inside biblical law. What is it that holds it all together? And I found Christ answered that one day when I was studying my Bible in the morning. In it, it was love God and love your neighbor. It's all about love. And I thought, well, I can't go down to the World Bank office on Monday morning and tell them it's all about love, because they'll think this is 1960s flower power or something like that. So I realized then that love actually is a quality of relationship, and God's passion is about the quality of our relationships. Are they intimate? Are they secure? Are they considerate? Are they other person centered? But also that relationships apply not just between individuals. I gathered later as I reflected more, but also between stakeholders in companies, for example, between ethnic groups, between people of different language groups, and ultimately between different nations. So at all levels, God is interested in the quality of those relationships. So
Michael, it's
hence,
very interesting you say in different nations, because we tend to think of love your neighbor. We only think in individualistic sense, a person, but
yeah,
it's between cities, between nations as well. And I think that is an obvious and yet not very often realized implication of that commandment.
yes, I think you're so right, Jeff. That's so right. And there's obviously lots of Old Testament examples of that. So Israel's relationship with Ammon or Moab or someone like that, or maybe the relationship between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. All of those themes are taken up, as well as the relationship between individuals or family groups or communities. So yes, all of those things apply. And in the New Testament, you have the relationships between the churches, which Paul pays so much attention to.
So you've had a lot of opportunity, actually, to try to walk this out in the practical world. South Africa has been one arena. The Sudan has been another. Rwanda, Ukraine. Have you seen any that this really works in the real world?
Oh, very much so. These are this provides the content framework, more importantly, perhaps the process as well, for peace building work. You've got to have a set of ideas which enable the two sides to come together, recognizing that they meet their mutual needs. And you have to have a process that helps the leaders get to know one another. And that was the key very much both in South Africa and ultimately in Sudan to ending the war there, that people got to know each other. So I remember, I think it was 2004, when the war had been going on in, I don't know how many years, 20 years or something in Sudan. And it was a person who'd come from our conferences from North Korea and another one from South Korea, who in the middle of the night at Lake Naivasha in Kenya, they got together and had a conversation and said, how can we fix this? We can't go on with this war. It just goes on. And here we are at another stalemate in this conference. So they hammered out an agreement between them. What would you accept? What would I accept? And it was because those two people trusted each other enough to really share their hearts that they found common ground. And when they put that to the conference the next morning, everybody said, yeah, that's fine with us. Let's go. And that was the basis of ending the war. And then the future, laid the foundation for what is Sudan today.
Now, you've mentioned Ukraine. Tell us a little bit about that. And is there any current involvement there?
So we got involved in this largely through my colleague, rather myself. He recognized long before I did the critical importance of the situation in Ukraine and particularly the relationship with Russia. He understood that. Jeremy Ive is his name, Dr. Jeremy Ive, and he's an Anglican minister actually, but he understood this very clearly when I really didn't. And I didn't really feel a calling to work in Ukraine, honestly, but he kind of dragged me along with his enthusiasm. But we developed in a sense as an organization, but it was under his initiative really, and under the chairman at that time, a lady in Geneva, that a process was developed as to how we could bring the Russian eastern parts of Ukraine and where they were fighting now against the Ukrainian government and the relevant oligarchs from cities like Mariupol. All of these people were critical to reach some agreement to move forward. And we could bring them together around an incredibly generous offer from, I think it was Germany, where they said they put in the equivalent of $70 billion at the time to clean up the city of Donbass, which was a center of the munitions industry. And there was a lot of chemical waste and everything swilling around underneath the city at that time. Unfortunately for us, we were sharing our ideas, obviously, and we needed the involvement of an international agency to help bring the Russians more on board. We were strong on the Ukrainian and the oligarch side, but less strong on the Russian side. We needed their support, and we said, will they help us with this process? And they, in the end, said, well, thanks very much, great idea, but we don't need you, we'll do it ourselves. And then the director, in the end, after 8 months, he hadn't managed to do it, so he left, moved on to another job, never happened. And now here we are today. But you realize that actually peace building really can prevent wars. If they are given a little bit of airtime, a little bit of oxygen, they really can prevent wars. And I think in South Africa too, I think the talks we ran, helping the ANC in particular, but also the white establishment, find common ground together on how to resolve the particular issues of nationalizing land, banks and mines, which was in the Freedom Charter of 1955. It was helping them find that common ground, which then opened the way to the Codesa talks and ultimately to peace in South Africa as well. So I think it's behind the scenes. We never get any publicity. we try simply to provide ways forward, and by God's grace, we've often managed to find them.
Well, let's come back to Korea now, and for the sake of our listeners, let's just sketch a bit of the background there. How that after the Second World War, Korea was divided into two zones along the 38th parallel. The north was occupied by the Soviet Union, and the south occupied by the United States. We have this on a slide as well. The negotiations on unification failed, and so separate governments were formed, as we know. And the Korean War began in 1950. Invasion by North Korea lasted till 1953. There was a ceasefire and a DMZ, the demilitarized zone, but no formal peace treaty has ever been signed. And even just this week, we've seen newspaper reports about North Korea firing artillery barrage into the ocean as a warning to South Korea. About 130 artillery rounds into a border area, which are described as a tit-for-tat move because of military operations going on with the US at this time. So we are faced with an ongoing situation there that has lasted our lifetime and has not shown any signs of improvement. How did you get involved with Korea, Mike?
Well, I think the backdrop is important, Jeff, that there are millions of Koreans around the world who pray every day for peace between North and South Korea and reunification of the peninsula, because they feel they're one people. And for them, it's not just an economic or even political issue. It's a gut issue. It's an identity issue. We are Koreans. We belong together, not apart. They mind passionately about it. So all this prayers going on in the background, as it was in South Africa, by the way, when we got involved there. So I believe ultimately, I can't describe it any other way than a calling. Originally, this was in 2017, January. And I won't go into all the details of that, although I could, as to how exactly that happened, how I was sure it was a calling from God, but I became certain it was. Now, before January 2017, I had been asked if I would help some South Koreans who wanted to get peace in Korea and recognize that they needed some expertise to be able to find a way forward. And I'd been to Korea by then twice, just to meet with them, talk to them, but nothing had been really agreed until just before November 2016, when I signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, to say that I would engage with them on this process. And then in January 2017, I gradually began to realize that the Lord was calling me to do this full time. So I started to go full time. By the time I dropped all my other activities, which you know all about, it was about October, November time. And from that time to now, which is 5 years now, I've been full time, doing nothing else, shuttling the world, really. Well, not much else. I'd have a few other things on the side, but shuttling the world, Washington, D.C., New York to the United Nations, Geneva, Seoul, unfortunately not to Pyongyang yet. One or two neighboring states as well, which I needed to visit. Still hoping to get into China as well as soon as I can. But just looking for how does one move this forward, and what would it look like? And I was sharing this with one South Korean on one occasion and one very senior North Korean diplomat on another occasion. And they said, look, we love this idea of a relational vision, which you talk about, but we don't really understand it. You must write it down. Please write it down. Well, then COVID came along, and I thought, well, actually, this is the opportunity. I could write it down. So I started not thinking it was going to go on for 2 or 3 years, COVID, but that's actually the time I needed. So since February 2020, I've been pretty much full-time writing this book. Yes. Now it's just got published, thankfully. Yeah.
That's the No Other Way to Peace in Korea.
Yes.
A practical path to reunification, and basically you spell out your plan, how this is feasible. I think we have a slide of this book coming up now, so yeah, to somebody who hasn't been tracking with you, all we hear about is how Kim Jong-un is building up his nuclear arsenals and firing rocket after rocket, showing his growing capacity to send missiles across Japan, across the Pacific even, to reach America, etc., etc. It doesn't really seem like there's a lot of a strong mood for reconciliation from the North Korean side. So coming back to where we started, how could the experience of achieving peace in Europe back in 1951, where Robert Schuman and his colleagues, Konrad Adenauer from Germany, Robert Schuman from France, Adenauer from Germany, de Gasperi from Italy, but particularly the German-French axis, where they were able to take this concrete step, set up the European coal and steel community, because coal and steel, as you know, were the necessary elements for any nation to develop a war machine. So how can this idea be applied into the Korean context, given the belligerence that we're seeing coming from Pyongyang right now?
So I think there are two aspects to answer that question. First of all, you do need to understand as context that rather than just writing a book, my work has been always aimed at how do you start a process? How does it get going? What's it going to look like? And that's a major part of what's in the book, which people can find, of course, on our website, I hope, relationalpeacebuilding.org, and order it if they want to. It's 600 pages, so it's a fairly major read, but I hope people will get interested enough in the ideas that are generated there to engage with it. But the question you asked me was, why fix on this European way forward, Jeff? That's what you asked me. And it came about as we were struggling to find a way to do this. I'd hit on the idea first of simply a trade agreement between North and South Korea, which of course was at the heart of the European coal and steel community. But then an American economist friend of mine said, you'd be much better, rather than calling it just a simple trade agreement, why don't we call it a community, an agriculture community? And of course, that resonated immediately with the European coal and steel community concept. And I realized that what Jean Monnet had suggested to Francois Schuman and to Konrad Adenauer through Robert Schuman, it was Robert Schuman, wasn't it? Through Robert Schuman was much more than a trade agreement. It was a plan to move towards ever closer union, but starting with a trade agreement. Let's just start with trade. And of course, in the context of the Ruhr Valley and the iron and steel resources, I think there was an element of shared ownership of those resources at that time as well, which is not something we've been able to include in our career suggestions. But we have been able to include, first of all, a trade agreement in one sector, which is more than simply a trade agreement, because the other brilliant idea that was introduced in the European coal and steel community that really was responsible then for its subsequent enormous development and success was the idea of putting in a jointly controlled, by the 6 nations involved, a jointly controlled high authority, they called it. We call it today the European Commission, but in those days it was called the High Authority, and they were tasked with driving the process forward to achieve much more than simply trade, but expanding it from trade in one commodity initially across all commodities, and then looking for other ways to drive a process of ever closer union. That was the big idea at the heart of the European coal and steel community. And I thought we could develop a Korean Peninsula agriculture community with the same concept of a high authority. We call it the Korean Peninsula Authority, which would have the same underlying purpose and goal to drive the process forward.
Now, there have been initiatives from the South, the audacious initiative that offered modernization to the North. Why have those plans failed, and why do you see the plan that you're suggesting has more hope?
Well, it goes back slightly to your earlier question about they're firing missiles all the time in North Korea. Why on earth would they want to do something like this when they're firing missiles? And our fundamental thesis is actually derives from a statement, a very significant statement we feel that was made by the North Korean ambassador to the United Nations in New York in September 2020. When he put it very simply on the table, he said what North Korea is looking for is economic modernization and to be shown respect. Now, the present government in South Korea has stepped up what it's offering way beyond what the Moon government ever offered to North Korea. So they're moving on from, tens of thousands of, tons of food or whatever it might have been, or some tourists going up into North Korea. They've made this much more expansive. This is now all about, modernizing the whole North Korean economy. So why is North Korea insulting South Korea at the offer and not willing to engage with it? That's a really important question. And the reason is because it doesn't satisfy the other condition that the North Korean ambassador stated, which is respect, because this is not a trade agreement. This is a one-way aid agreement. And the trouble is, particularly in Asian culture, but I think it's true anywhere in the world, if you offer somebody aid, there is a patronizing undercurrent to that. You're basically saying, look, we've got more than you, we're richer than you. In Confucian language, which is their kind of underlying philosophy, Confucianism, in the underlying philosophy, that's the idea of the older brother, younger brother. The older brother is responsible for the younger brother and has an obligation to help them and aid them in any way they can. But in return for what the older brother does, the younger brother has to show a certain amount of deference, respect, and do somewhat what the older brother wants. So the audacious initiative was apparently the offer of an older brother, as far as the North Koreans were concerned, the offer of an older brother to a younger brother. And North Korea does not want to be treated as a younger brother by South Korea. I'm sorry, you may be richer, but you're not our older brother in that sense. No, we reject it on that basis. So trade is much more acceptable than aid as a starting point. That's our position.
Now, in the French-German situation, this reconciliation could only begin to take place after Hitler was out of the way, that there was total change. That won't be the situation with Korea. Going back to Ukraine, it will probably be a necessary precondition that the the Putin administration would be well and truly out of the way before such forgiveness and reconciliation could take place. But you have hope that in Korea, it's not exactly the same parallel as with Hitler in a war. The war did end in 1953, even though there hasn't been a peace treaty. What are the steps that you see that could eventually lead to the fulfillment of this purpose, this plan?
Well, I don't see Kim Jong-un needing to move on. And in fact, it's a huge benefit in some ways that he's there, I think, because you can't negotiate without someone to negotiate with. You can't talk to somebody unless there's a leader there who's really well established and who can carry the country with him. And in the same way that de Klerk was able to carry forward the National Party in North Korea, in South Africa, we believe Kim Jong-un, if he wants to, could move the country forward towards this kind of reunification and become a national hero, although now he's regarded as a national horror or whatever by certain people in South Korea, at least. Yeah.
Yes.
So we might see a real change take place, but why should he want to do it? What's in it for him, in a sense, or what's in it for his country? Well, he's always said that he wants economic modernization. He does care, I believe, deeply about the rural suffering that's going on, but he just doesn't dare trust the promises of the US and Europe, for that matter. Oh, we'll help you and we'll do this and that and the other, and we'll guarantee your security. Well, he's saying, well, what about Libya? They denuclearized. What happened to them? Or what about Ukraine, for that matter? You know, they denuclearized. And what happened? Well, no, they denuclearized. And then Russia walks into Crimea. And what does the rest of the world do? Absolutely nothing. There was nothing in the UK press about the promises we'd made in 1994, you know, that we would, or before when they denuclearized, that we would protect them. So, and by the way, there was nothing about our promises to Russia either, that we would not allow NATO to advance beyond the boundary of East Germany when Germany was reunified. We promised Russia that, and we've broken our promises on both accounts, both to Ukraine and to Russia. And then we point the finger at them and say, look, awful people they are, look what they're doing, killing each other and all the rest. I'm sorry, it's not enough. We need to accept some responsibility in Europe for these things, in my view, and ask God's forgiveness as a minimum starting point. But we must acknowledge that we are to some degree responsible for these wars. But in the case of Korea, I think that Kim Jong-un really does want peace. But the trouble is, nobody's put a big enough offer on the table, which also shows him respect. And we think that the Korean Peninsula agriculture community, as in the case of the European coal and steel community, offers respect to both parties. That was the genius of the idea. It wasn't that one side would lose face or lose resources. The genius of the idea was that both parties were respected. And that's what we've tried to emulate in what we are doing in Korea.
Yes, there was a level table there. There's a playing field. It's obvious that this is not going to work if it's seen as an offer from the South. There has to be, in a sense, a neutral party that comes in, and I believe that's the line you're working on. A kind of a third party is able to put this thing on the table, supported by other nations, so that it is not seen as capitulation to the South in any way. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. And my view, yet to be proved true, Jeff, is that the UN Security Council could potentially endorse the plan. Because we're in a situation where the growing tensions are fascinating, because they are narrowing the window of opportunity, and at any moment things could go terribly wrong. It's only got to be one firing of a salvo in the wrong place, one killing of 500 South Koreans or something by some missile going in the wrong area or the wrong place, or similarly into North Korea. I mean, things can go very badly wrong by accident. So we're in a very dangerous place right now. And my colleague Jeremy Ive is constantly saying, don't underestimate the danger of this situation. But on the other hand, the heightened tensions have a positive dimension to them as well, because now the US and China actually agree on one major point. They want denuclearization of the peninsula. In fact, everybody now agrees they want denuclearization of the peninsula, because South Korea now is wanting its own nuclear weapons. And whether they get them directly from the US or whether they get them, start making them themselves with technology from Israel or wherever, or Iran, or wherever they may choose to go for it, and people will sell them the nuclear technology for missiles. They already have lots of nuclear plants in the country, and they have massive financial resources and technological resources in South Korea, as you know. They are very advanced in their IT systems and all of that. So I think they're quite capable of making nuclear weapons. But if you had nuclear weapons in South Korea, imagine how China would feel, because Japan wants nuclear weapons now as well. And Taiwan's got nuclear weapons standing behind it in the form of the US. So China would feel itself thoroughly surrounded, and they don't want that. At the same time, the US does not want to have mainland US threatened by North Korean ICBMs, which is now, not very far away. It's very close. They could knock it down the road under previous administrations, but they can't go on pushing it down the road now, because it's becoming imminent within a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years. So there is really an urgent need from the UN, from the UN Security Council, to agree, yeah, okay, we would support a step-by-step process of economic modernization in parallel with a step-by-step process towards denuclearization. And we've suggested, with the ultimate realization that North Korea will never totally denuclearize, that is the honest truth in my view, without reunification of the peninsula. So we think now the international community actually will want or need to achieve total reunification of the peninsula in order to bring peace in the region. That is the great opportunity that I think is opening up before us at the moment.
What signals are you receiving from the international community that make others show they see real potential in this plan?
Well, of course, we talk a lot to the UN DPPA, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. So we've been talking to them for several years. But our friend on the North Korean desk there said to me just earlier this week, I think it was, or may have been the end of last week, don't quite remember, but one or the other. He said to me, look, you've been talking about this now for several years, and it's always looked interesting to us. We've always been very supportive of what you're trying to do. But he said to me, actually now it looks more relevant and more interesting and more possible than at any time since I first met you. And I've worked on this now for 8 years on this desk. I really know the ground well. And the UN Security Council has not said anything positive, basically, to both North and South Korea together over that period. And this year's been totally depressing for me. So he ordered a copy of the book, said, I'm going to cheer myself up reading your book over Christmas. But
are you
yeah,
trying to get the book to Kim Jong-un?
I'm trying to get him one at the moment. Yes, I'm hopeful that he will get one, hopefully before Christmas as well. But I can't be sure, because the lines of communication are quite complicated to North Korea.
What language would that be?
Sorry? What language?
I read that you're hoping the Korean edition will come out in April. So would this be in an English copy?
Yeah, it would have to be in English, but he's got plenty of people who can translate it. Yes. And we will point him towards where it starts in chapter 4. But yeah, he'll have to get it translated in North Korea. But we are producing all of our website, as you may know, is in English and Mandarin for the Chinese, and also in the North and South Korean dialects. So right from the beginning, we have made it clear we are a neutral party. Everything on the website is in both languages, accessible to both. And we believe that the website is accessed by North Korea, as well as, of course, by people from South Korea and the international community. It goes to all countries.
And are you seeing any interest from Brussels or London or Washington? You've had a revolving door of prime ministers in London. Is there any interest being shown there?
Well, again, the honest truth is I've never had a great deal of support from the Foreign Office on any of my peace initiatives up to now. I mean, they've engaged with them politely because we're British citizens, but never with much enthusiasm up to now.
Yes.
But in US, I've really concentrated much more on Washington, D.C.
Okay.
and New York
Yeah.
than London, to be honest, because Britain's a fairly minor player in the world now, whereas Washington, D.C. really is key. It's on the Security Council. And basically, we think England and France will go with what the US probably wants to do here. So we've engaged with the major think tanks there, which are the US Institute of Peace, the National Committee on North Korea, and the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Korea expert in the Council on Foreign Relations wrote a most supportive quote for us. And when I was last there in April, the three of them together convened a seminar where I was able to present the ideas. So Council of Foreign Relations, it wasn't an official sponsorship of the event because it was just too short a time and complicated to go through their channels. But the person in charge of the Korea program was there, was personally very supportive. And similarly, the person from the National Committee on North Korea, which is a very important group of experts on North Korea and philanthropic organizations working in North Korea. The leaders of those organizations are all in the National Committee on North Korea or linked to it. And the other one, the US Institute of Peace, has run a separate seminar in addition to the one in April, the previous November, a year ago, when they called together a group of people for a webinar on this Korean Peninsula agriculture community concept. And someone from the State Department actually came to that meeting. So we are pretty sure the State Department is fully aware of what we're saying. Again, the problem is, what is the starting point? What's going to trigger this to kick it off? And we have a very clear idea of how that can be done. And that's the one thing I'm afraid I can't share on this meeting today.
Now, let's go back to the forgiveness and reconciliation aspect. In the European situation with Schuman and Adenauer, as well as de Gasperi, Germany, France, and Italy, these three men all had something very much in common, and that was their Catholic faith. They were devout Catholics, steeped in Catholic social teaching, and they understood human beings as created in the image of God. Therefore, they had a basis for talking about the dignity, and they had a basis for talking about forgiveness, and as a basis for reconciliation. You're not dealing with any of that background in North Korea. You may be in South Korea, more Christian influence there. Can forgiveness and reconciliation be achieved there without the same kind of background that we saw here in Europe?
Well, we think a very good place to start, Jeff, is with the churches in South Korea. They are about 25% of the population are Christians in South Korea, and they do take their religion a lot more seriously than we do in Europe, let me tell you.
Yes.
But I had a fascinating conversation a couple of weeks ago when I was in Seoul with the head of the Unification Committee of probably the second biggest church in South Korea. And I think he must have been about 10 or 11 at the time of the Korean War. So he may have had some pretty tough experiences in his history, but he basically said to me, look, I talked to him about forgiveness, exactly that question about forgiveness. And he said, look, I don't think we should forgive, and we certainly cannot preach forgiveness from our pulpit unless North Korea apologizes first. And it seemed to me that, and I tried to persuade him at this point, but I needed to gather my my ammunition, if I can use that term inappropriately, for the argument. But I think the idea of Christian forgiveness is always unilateral and unconditional. And
yes, and Jesus' prayer on the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do. Yes,
is part of that. I never quite clear who he's referring to there, by the way, whether it's just the soldiers or whether it's the world. But I think Jesus in the story of the two debtors makes it clear, at least for the Christian community, if God has forgiven you for the multitude of wrong things you've done as an individual, and because you're involved as a citizen in a country that has done so many wrong things, both now and in the past. If God is prepared to forgive all of those things, it's like 10,000 talents in the story of there's two debtors. And what are you being asked to do? You're being asked to forgive a very tiny amount compared to all of those things. So get your head around it. Just, you need to accept the need for unilateral and unconditional forgiveness. Now, in my own experience of needing to forgive somebody very close to me, not in my immediate family, but very close to me, I've realized that forgiveness is not something you can simply decide to do one day and you forgive and it's all gone. It is something that you have to wrestle with day after day after day in your prayers, in your thinking. You have to really work it through. And it takes, well, for me, it took months before I felt that it had really been resolved in my own heart. So I'm not saying this is ever easy, personally or between states or subparts of countries or whatever it may be. This is a tough journey, but I think that is absolutely essential if those Christians really want reunification, if they really want to engage with North Korea. The first step is to forgive the North Koreans, forgive the Kim family for what the grandfather and the father and now Kim Jong-un is doing. Forgive them, forgive and let it past. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need formal processes. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, the one in South Africa, offered people amnesty if they would come and confess all the things that they'd done. Then they got an amnesty. Now, there are various ways politically of handling what is a delicate and difficult situation. If one was confronted in the future with Kim Jong-un and his family supporting this process and then saying ultimately, look, I also personally and for my family need forgiveness for where I've done things that are wrong, which I know I have, and I'm asking for forgiveness. And if he asks for forgiveness ever in the future, which is hard to imagine that he might even consider that, but if ever he did, because this process had really rolled on and he'd seen all the benefits of it and all the fruit of it, and realized that this would be the major achievement and legacy of his lifetime, to reunify the peninsula, then I think the international community and the South Koreans would have to find it in their hearts to say, all right, you have really done what you can to put things right. So yeah, and to bring about reunification when it has not been easy for you.
Yeah. 7 times 70 is a big number, isn't it?
It is a very big number, and I think it was meant to represent infinity, actually.
Yes, yes, yes. Of course, these questions have parallels in the Ukrainian situation with Russia, and some of my Ukrainian friends have said, well, talking about forgiveness right now is like making a joke at a funeral. It's inappropriate. However, sooner or later, it has to be faced. And if we come back to the European situation, Robert Schuman talked about Europe being really based on Christian values as a community of peoples. But as you and I know, the EU and the UK really no longer are prepared to acknowledge Europe's Christian heritage. We love to talk about dignity. We love to talk about equality and freedom and brotherhood, but we don't examine what do we base dignity on and sanctity of life. If we abandon human beings created in the image of God, how can we talk about brotherhood if we don't start talking about fatherhood? There have never been brothers without the same father, by definition. How can we talk about equality if you and I are nothing but the chance product of a long process of slime plus time? Now, it seems, therefore, as I heard somebody say this week in Brussels, everybody loves apples, but we forget that apples come from trees with roots. And we all want these European values, but we're not really prepared to acknowledge what those roots are. So, Michael, in your experience, how sustainable is peace and prosperity in Europe without a return to these Christian foundations?
Well, I think the stability of countries, whether it's the UK or those in continental Europe or the European Union collectively, is undermined deeply if people become very individualistic in their thinking. And I think the danger of the whole European platform of human rights, whereas I think in its original conception meant something rather different than it does today, but in its interpretation today, it's very much understood as my rights and my entitlements over against you. Mm-hmm. And that individualism drives social division and also drives the kinds of problems we're seeing of social unrest, whether it's in Britain or in France with strikes. It undermines the whole social order. And I'm always brought to mind, it always brings to mind that last verse in the book of Judges in the Bible: everyone did right in what was right in his own eyes. Mm-hmm. And when everyone starts to do what is right in their own eyes, that's my rights, that's my entitlement, don't you tell me what to do, then I think you're in a very dangerous place. And we actually wrote a book on this, as you may know, called Relational Rights, which was written actually by a Chinese Malaysian who came and wrote it for us or with us, where we said, look, from the rest of the world's point of view, outside US and Europe, people don't define their own identity, whereby today I'm a man, tomorrow I'm a woman, and on Wednesday I'm going to be a cardboard box or a horse or whatever it may be. I will decide my identity, that's my choice, and you can't argue with it. Well, I'm sorry, that isn't how the rest of the world thinks, whether it's China or India or Africa, the big centers of population all over the world, which make up the United Nations, majority nations now, demographically, all think differently. It is all about, we're defined through our relationships. In Africa, this is Ubuntu. Yeah. I am because we are, you know these terms, I'm sure. And obviously, because of these countries thinking so differently, the UN is now deeply divided as well, and won't survive, we believe, as an institution unless it finds some better language or some better way of articulating national responsibilities than this individualistic understanding of human rights. But my concern for Europe, and it is a deep concern, as well as very much for the UK, which I pray for day and night, by the way, in this regard, is that somehow, by God's grace, we will come back to our original Christian understanding, because we have to understand that as you said exactly, it is because we are created in the image of a relational God that these words like the dignity of the person, but also the importance of relationships as the central way of thinking about how we manage social cohesion and how we manage nation building as well as peace building. Without that core underlying concept, it's very difficult to see how these nations are going to cohere.
Yeah. Yes. And one last question. What is the role of the body of Christ, the church, in that process of restoring this understanding? It seems like this area, we're very quick to say Jesus is Lord of all, but that's not reflected actually in our theological education. We talk about theology for the church, theology of the Bible, theology of personal life, but not theology of the public domain, which is the area that you've been very, very active in, trying to bring the biblical understanding to bear in what this means in the business world, in the political world, in every area of civil society. And in this sense, we've got a lot of ground to recover ourselves in our own house. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. Yeah. When I was in South Korea again this time, I was talking at a university there, and the Dean of Studies, or the guy just actually stepped down as Dean of Studies, said to me, I think the problem the church has got in South Korea is not dissimilar from the one in Europe. He said that the church is not really touching society. It has a message for itself, but it isn't really impacting on society because it hasn't found the language or the categories within which it can effectively communicate into public space, and therefore it has no essential message which is relevant to the big questions the society is asking. Now, I've had this rather ridiculous situation where I brought out 2 major books within a month, but that wasn't my planning, believe me. But the second one is called "Is Corporate Capitalism the Best We Have to Offer?" You remember you showed a slide of the original cover of that. We now, I think, have a rather better cover for it than that. But that book basically says that, listen carefully to the words, the purpose of a company is to serve society by maximizing long-term value creation for all its major stakeholders, employees, suppliers, customers, and shareholders.
Yes.
Whereas the World Economic Forum is saying a company, a stakeholder company, is defined by its relationships with governments, NGOs, and the international community. But those are all kind of amorphous groups, if you see what I mean. They're not easily defined and easily communicated with and easy to build relationships with. It's a non-relational vision. And either you go down a non-relational route like that, which sounds wonderful in words, but doesn't really have much substance. But the point is, out of a Christian social understanding or relational understanding comes this kind of very practical suggestion as to how to reform companies. Or it may be how to teach relational literacy and transform the content of education so people learn at school how to relate to people of different languages and different nations in a systematic way, how to relate to their parents, to someone of the other gender, or whatever it may be. How do you conduct those relationships? Relational literacy, we call it. Now you can apply it into education or relational justice, which we've talked about so much, Jeff, and so on. So every area you can apply the fundamental core ideas of the Christian faith. And we think the churches have an absolutely critical role. And I think you are right in what you're saying, Jeff. We must, in a sense, start in the theological colleges and get people thinking differently in their theological education, that how they reach out to the public and the positioning of the church in the public square is critical to the credibility of the gospel, and therefore critical in how people will receive their core message of a relationship in the end with Christ.
There are a lot of people in Korea who are waking up to some of the riches that the Dutchman Abraham Kuyper left in his legacy concerning this kind of understanding. I've just finished a series, a learning community with folk going through Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism. And the point he makes again and again is the Reformation under Luther had its theological focus on justification by faith. Calvin took it further. His theological focus was the sovereignty of God over everything. And this is what we need to recover, in what way we see the sovereignty of God to bring about the relational wholeness, the shalom, that is at the core of your concept of relational thinking. Now, for our watchers, can you repeat the website where people can go to find out more about relational thinking and the initiatives you're taking?
So there are 3. The first is relationalpeacebuilding.org, relationalpeacebuilding.org. There you'll find the book on Korea, which unpacks what a relational view would look like if Korea moved from a socialist or capitalist model into a relational model. What would it look like? Both have to change, not just one. Relational research, that's relationalresearch, one word, .org. relationalresearch.org, you can download free of charge the book called Relational Rights, which critiques individualistic human rights and suggests this alternative way of understanding human rights and also how you litigate any claims of human rights, which involves much more the community, because you're looking at the rights and responsibilities of both parties in the relationship, not just one party's rights with no mention of responsibilities, but both parties' rights and responsibilities. And then the third one, of course, is the Jubilee Center. Now, the Jubilee Center is just in a transition phase right now. It's just about to have its website put up again. I've just taken over again as chairman of its trustees. It has massive resources in this area from a Christian, specifically Christian point of view, which again, you're well aware of yourself, I know, but it's Jubilee-Center, spelled the British way, not the American way, jubilee-center.org. And one last website is important. It's called the-relationist.net, the-relationist.net. That website contains pretty much all of these resources in one place, and blogs now that are coming out regularly, looking at the pandemic, for example, from a relational point of view and that sort of thing. So those are the key websites to look at.
Thank you.
And one more.
Yeah, go
one
ahead.
more. Relationshipsfoundation.org. That's on relational schools especially, but relationships, plural, relationships-foundation, one word, .org. Relationshipsfoundation.org. So those 5 websites probably are the key.
Thank you so much, Michael. I just really want to encourage our listeners to explore the rich resources that have come out of Michael's kitchen, as it were, that have extremely been influential in my own thinking the last 20 years. And thank you, Michael, for the initiatives you've taken here for Korea, for explaining that today. We wish you every success, God's blessing on this, and we will continue to uphold this project in prayer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Jeff, and for your own personal support and encouragement over a very long time. Thank you very, very much.
And we wish all of our listeners a Merry Christmas and a wonderful New Year, despite all the clouds of war that gather on the horizons around us, because he is the Prince of Peace. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.